The rise and fall of Australia's most notorious suburb, Cabramatta, Sydney. In the 1990s, there was an address in the west of Sydney that meant, wherever it was spoken in the country, one thing: danger. Police called it a no-go zone. Television crews filmed its streets the way they filmed conflict overseas, with the camera held low and the voiceover grim. The nation's newspapers named it the heroin capital of Australia, and its railway station, one stop on an ordinary suburban line, became the most notorious open drug market in the country. In 1994, a member of parliament was shot dead on the footpath outside his own home here, in what is still widely described as the first political assassination in Australian history. For the better part of a decade, the suburb stood in the national imagination for everything the country was afraid of at once: drugs, gangs, foreigners, collapse, and then something that almost no one predicted. The same community that had lived through the worst of it turned the suburb around by its own hand and made the most feared place in Australia into one of the most loved. This is the story of Cabramatta, a suburb that refused to stay a headline. Chapter 1. The Fall of Saigon. The story does not begin in Sydney. It begins 8,000 kilometres to the north, on the last day of April 1975, when the city of Saigon fell and the Vietnam War ended not with a settlement, but with a rout. For weeks, the roads into the city had been filling with people moving south ahead of the advance, and on the morning of the 30th, the last Americans were lifted by helicopter from rooftops, while crowds pressed against the embassy gates below. By that afternoon, the war was over. What followed it for hundreds of thousands of people was a decision made in a matter of hours: to stay in a country whose government had just ceased to exist, or to leave with whatever could be carried and no idea of where the leaving would end. They left by every means available. Some flew out in the final days, on military transports and chartered aircraft. Among them, the several thousand infants and children moved in the airlift that emptied the orphanages before the city changed hands. Far more left later, and by sea, in fishing boats and coastal craft never built for open water, pushing out into the South China Sea toward whatever shore would have them. The passages ran for days. Many did not survive them. Those who did came ashore in camps across Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, and waited sometimes for years for a country somewhere else to agree to take them in. Australia was one of the countries that agreed, and it was, at that moment, an unlikely one. For most of the previous 70 years, the nation had operated under a formal policy of racial exclusion, a body of law and practice known as the White Australia Policy, designed for the express purpose of keeping arrivals of exactly this kind out. That policy had been dismantled only in the years just before Saigon fell, its final elements removed in 1973, barely 2 years earlier. The country that opened its doors to the boats had been, within living memory of every official who processed them, legally closed to them. The first refugee boat to reach Australian territory under its own power arrived off Darwin in 1976. 5 men who had navigated from Vietnam across open ocean without charts. Behind them, over the years that followed, came tens of thousands more, most by aircraft from the camps under an expanding government program, some by sea. They arrived with almost nothing: a change of clothes, a photograph, a language almost no one around them could read or speak. They had survived a war, a sea, and a camp, and the country that received them had, for most of its history, been built to turn them away. Where the government sent them first would decide where they stayed. Chapter 2. The hostel. At the end of the line, it sent a great many of them to a place called the Cabramatta Migrant Hostel, at the far western end of a suburban railway line, some 30 kilometres from the centre of Sydney. The hostel was a plain arrangement of huts and dormitories that the government had used to process new arrivals since the years of post-war European migration, and by the late 1970s it had become one of the first Australian addresses that thousands of Vietnamese families ever knew. A family stepped off the aircraft, was moved through the hostel, and learned the geography of a new country from its front gate outward. What lay immediately beyond that gate was Cabramatta. The suburb they found was poor and only half finished. It sat at the outer edge of the city's spread, past the older and wealthier suburbs, on flat ground that the rest of Sydney had not yet found a reason to want. Rent was among the cheapest available anywhere within reach of the city. There was work of a kind in the factories of the surrounding districts, unskilled and low-paid, and little else. For a family arriving with no capital, no English, and no local name, the suburb offered the one thing that mattered more than any of the things it lacked: a place they could afford to stay. And so they stayed, and then others came to join them, and the mechanism that shaped Cabramatta for the next 30 years began to turn. A family settled near the hostel would sponsor relatives still waiting in the camps, and those relatives, when they came, settled beside them. Word travelled back along the same lines it always travels among people starting over, that in this one suburb there were others who spoke the language, shops beginning to stock the right food, a temple, a familiar face on the street. Each arrival made the next arrival easier. The community did not spread itself thinly across the city. It concentrated deliberately and by preference in the few square kilometres around the end of the line. The conditions those years were hard by every measure the statistics could capture. Unemployment in the suburb ran far above the levels of the city around it. Incomes were low, households were crowded, and the language barrier shut most of the first generation out of the work. Their qualifications should have earned them, so that people who had been teachers and clerks and soldiers in Vietnam assembled parts on a factory line in Sydney if they worked at all. The wider country regarded the whole enterprise with suspicion, uncertain that these arrivals could ever be made to belong. The people living around the hostel answered the doubt in the only way available to them, which was to build, slowly and without much help, a life out of almost nothing. What they built first was a shopfront. Chapter 3. Little Saigon. It began with the grocers because a community has to eat before it can do anything else, and the food a Vietnamese family wanted could not be bought in an ordinary Australian shop in 1980. So the families opened their own. A grocer stocked the herbs and the rice and the fish sauce that the supermarkets did not carry. Beside the grocer, a cook opened a small restaurant, and beside the restaurant, a herbalist laid out the roots and dried remedies of a medicine the surrounding country had never heard of. And beside the herbalist, a bakery sold bread in a form that was neither quite French nor quite Vietnamese, but belonged to both. One shopfront at a time, along John Street and the roads that crossed it, the suburb changed its face. The signage changed with it. The lettering above the doors was Vietnamese, and then Chinese as well, as ethnic Chinese families from Vietnam and elsewhere in the region settled into the same streets, until a person walking the shopping strip could pass a full block without reading a word of English. The smell of the place changed. Coriander and star anise and grilling pork carried out of open shop fronts onto the footpath. The sound of it changed. Within a few years, the suburb that the government had chosen, more or less at random, had become something no government had planned, the largest concentration of Vietnamese people anywhere in Australia, and the acknowledged capital of their life in the country. People gave it the name that fit. They called it Little Saigon. The name carried weight because for the people who used it, the first Saigon was gone. The city they had fled had been renamed by the government that took it, and the country they had known no longer existed in any form they could return to. Cabramatta was not merely a place many of them happened to live. It was the one place on earth where the world they had lost was being deliberately rebuilt, shop by shop and street by street, in a country that had until recently been closed to them. The rebuilding was an act of memory as much as commerce, and by the start of the 1990s the community was ready to mark it in something more permanent than a shopfront. In 1991, at the head of the shopping precinct, they raised a gate. It was a traditional ceremonial arch of the kind that stands at the entrance to a Chinese or Vietnamese quarter, a Pai Lao, and it opened onto a pedestrian square the community named Freedom Plaza. The choice of word was exact and unmistakable. Cut into the structure were inscriptions that spoke not of trade or welcome, but of liberty and of democracy, the two things the people who built it had crossed an ocean to find and had not found in the country they left. The gate was a statement of ownership in the deepest sense. It announced that this ground, at the poor end of a suburban railway line, now belonged to a people who had arrived with nothing and made it theirs. The generation that raised the gate had come through war and sea and poverty and built, against the expectations of the country around them, a world. Their children were being raised inside it, and the children were not the same. Chapter 4. The children without love. They had been born to it or brought to it too young to remember anything else, and they were growing up in a gap their parents could not see across. At home was a language, a discipline, and a set of expectations formed in a Vietnam that no longer existed. Outside the front door was Australia. In a suburb the wider country had already learned to look down on. The children belonged fully to neither. They spoke English their parents could not follow, and Vietnamese their teachers could not hear, and they moved between the two worlds carrying, most days, the full weight of translating one to the other, at the bank, at the doctor, at the government office, a child speaking for a family. Their parents were, in a great many cases, not there, not through any absence of care, but because survival in the new country demanded every hour they had. A generation that had lost its qualifications at the border worked the longest and lowest shifts the economy offered, in factories and kitchens and cleaning rounds, and came home with nothing left to give. Many of them were carrying more than exhaustion. They had survived the war, the boats, the camps, and the losses that came with all three, and the country that received them offered little in the way of help for what those years had done to a person. A child could grow up in a crowded flat in Cabramatta, with two parents present and still, in every practical sense, be raising itself. The country outside offered no better shelter. The schools were overstretched and largely unequipped for children arriving with no English and no grounding, and many of those children fell out of the system early and quietly. The wider society had not decided that these families belonged, and a young person felt that verdict daily in the shops beyond the suburb, in the looks, in the doors that did not open. Between a home too tired to hold them and a country that did not want them, a space opened in the middle of the 1980s, and into that space, as happens wherever such a space opens, came something that offered the young what nothing else was offering: belonging. It took the form of a gang, and the gang took a name that has been argued over ever since. The name was 5T. The reading most often given to it renders the 5 letters as the first sounds of a Vietnamese phrase that translates closely as youth or childhood without love, a description less of a criminal purpose than of a condition. Other readings exist, glossing the 5 as a different set of Vietnamese words entirely, and the true origin is genuinely contested and cannot be settled here. What is not contested is what the name pointed to. It named a generation of children who had come through dislocation and found on their own streets that the only thing on offer to them was one another. Its leader was a boy who had come the same way they all had. Tri Minh Tran had been born in Vietnam in the year Saigon fell and had reached Australia as a small child, a child of the boats like the rest of them, carried out of one country and set down in another before he was old enough to choose. By his early teens, he was leading the group, a figure of real authority on the streets of the suburb, while still, by any measure, the law recognized, a boy himself. The members of 5T were not born criminals, and nothing in their beginning marked them for what parts of them would become. They were the children of a war their parents had fled, and a country that had not yet made room for them, and the road that ran from that gap in the mid-1980s toward what the next decade would call Cabramatta was only just beginning to open. Chapter 5. The Smack Express. The gap opened and heroin filled it. Through the early 1990s, the drug arrived in Cabramatta in a volume the suburb had never seen and the country had no answer for, cheap enough and pure enough that a habit could be started for the price of a meal. It did not stay in the alleys, it moved into the open, sold on footpaths in daylight, passed hand to hand outside the shops that a refugee generation had built from nothing a decade earlier. Within a few years, the name of the suburb, spoken anywhere in Australia, had acquired a single meaning, and the newspapers gave it a title that stuck: the heroin capital of the country. The centre of it was the railway station. Cabramatta sat at the end of a line that ran straight into the heart of Sydney, and that line worked in both directions. Buyers came out from the city on the train, bought on the concourse or in the streets around it, and rode back the same afternoon. And the trade organized itself around the timetable with a logic no one had planned. The station became the most notorious open drug market in the nation, and it earned a name of its own in the reporting of the period: the Smack Express. The platforms, the underpass, The stairwells that carried commuters to and from the trains became a marketplace that operated in full view on a suburban station in the middle of a residential suburb 30 kilometers from the center of the city. The overdoses happened where the drug was sold. They happened in the streets, in the public toilets, in the stairwells of the station, and the car parks behind the shops. And they happened often enough that the ambulance officers who worked the district came to know the ground by heart. Some of the dead were the buyers who arrived on the train. Most were not. The greater share of the suffering fell where it always falls in a drug economy, on the people who lived on top of it, and in Cabramatta that meant, above all, the Vietnamese Australian residents themselves. It was their children who were drawn into the trade, and their children who were buried out of it. Their shop fronts the market operated in front of, their streets the cameras filmed. They had survived a war, a passage by boat, a hostel at the end of the line, and the making of a home from nothing. And now they watched a second generation lost to a needle in the suburb they had built. The cameras came for the worst of it. Television crews filmed Cabramatta the way crews film a conflict, framing a Sydney suburb as a foreign war zone on the far edge of the city, cutting to the same underpass and the same discarded syringe, returning for the arrest and the overdose, and leaving before anything else. The coverage of those years traded in a particular set of images, and the images did their work. To the rest of the country, Cabramatta became a place on a map you did not go, a no-go zone in the national imagination, a shorthand for drugs and gangs, and a foreignness the country had never been sure it wanted. What the coverage rarely showed was a community living inside the frame, going to work, opening its shops in the morning, and beginning, quietly, to organize against the thing that was killing its children. The suburb had one man in the state parliament, and he had made the crisis his own. Chapter 6. The member for Cabramatta. John Newman was the Labour member for Cabramatta in the New South Wales Parliament, and he had made the suburb's crisis the centre of his public life. He was not a quiet representative of a difficult electorate. He was loud, deliberately and continuously loud, a politician who put his name and his face to the fight against organised crime in the district, and did so in the full knowledge of who was listening. He walked the streets he represented. He spoke about the drug trade and the gangs that ran it in terms that left no room for retreat, in the parliament, in the press, on the record, and he did it under his own name in a suburb where a great many people preferred that names stayed unspoken. Newman himself was an immigrant born in Austria as Johann Naumann, a man who had remade himself in Australia in much the way the electorate around him had. He understood the community he represented, and he refused to accept the version of it that the cameras were selling to the rest of the country. His argument was not that Cabramatta was a war zone. His argument was that a criminal trade had fastened itself onto a community that did not want it and could not, on its own, dislodge it, and that the state had a duty to act. He pressed that argument harder and longer than any other public figure of the period, and in pressing it, he made himself the most visible opponent of the people profiting from the trade. The threats followed the visibility. Newman reported that he was being intimidated, that he had been warned, that the campaign he was running had made him enemies who wanted him to stop. He did not stop. He took the threats to the police, and he took his case back to the Parliament, and he kept naming in public the thing he said was strangling his electorate. A politician in a safe seat could have managed the suburb quietly and let the reporting wash over it. Newman chose the opposite course, and he chose it with a directness that made him, by the middle of 1994, both the most prominent champion the suburb had and the most exposed man in it. He had told people more than once that he believed his life was in danger. Chapter 7. The First Assassination. On the evening of the 5th of September 1994, John Newman drove home to his house in Cabramatta with his partner beside him. As he stepped from the car in his own driveway, a gunman was waiting, and Newman was shot dead outside his own front door. His partner was there. It happened at his home, in the electorate he represented, in the suburb whose crisis he had made his life's work, and it happened to a sitting member of the state parliament in a country that had no precedent for it. The shock ran well beyond Cabramatta. A member of parliament had been killed deliberately and at his home for what he did in public office. and the event was widely described as the first political assassination in Australian history. The description carried a particular weight in a country that had long thought of that kind of violence as something that happened elsewhere. The killing became national news of a different order than the drug coverage that preceded it, and it fixed Cabramatta in the national mind more firmly than any overdose statistic had, as the place where a politician was gunned down on his own street. The investigation was long. There was no swift arrest, no confession in the first weeks, and the case moved slowly through years of police work before it reached a courtroom. Attention settled over time on Phuong Ngu, a local figure and political rival who had stood against Newman and lost, and who operated in the same suburb. Ngu was charged in 1998. What followed was not a single trial, but a sequence of them, drawn out and contested, before the matter was finally resolved. In 2001, Phuong Ngu was convicted of the murder of John Newman and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case did not close entirely with the verdict. It was appealed, and the appeal did not overturn the conviction. It was later reviewed, and the review did not disturb it either. Throughout the proceedings and in the years after them, Phuong Ngu has maintained his innocence, and he has continued to do so. What the record establishes is the conviction and the sentence, arrived at after multiple trials and tested on appeal and on review, and the record does not establish anything beyond that. A man was convicted of the murder and imprisoned for it, and a man has continued to say he did not do it. And those two facts sit alongside each other in the file, exactly as they are stated here. What is not in dispute is the effect on the suburb. Newman was dead, the one public figure who had made Cabramatta's crisis his personal fight, and the drug trade he had fought against did not stop when he fell. It went on, and it deepened, and the years that followed were the worst the suburb would know. Chapter 8. Rock Bottom. By the middle of the 90s, the crisis in Cabramatta had stopped being a series of events and become a condition. The heroin did not arrive in waves anymore. It was simply there, sold in the open around the railway station, in the arcades, in the stairwells and the public toilets, at prices and in quantities that no part-time police post opened in 1995 was ever going to shift. The overdoses happened in daylight. Ambulance crews learned the addresses. A generation of young people, many of them the children of refugees who had crossed an ocean to keep them safe, was being lost one body at a time in a suburb their parents had built from nothing 30 kilometers from the city. The gang that had formed in the mid-80s out of neglect and dislocation had, by now, fractured. What had once been a loose brotherhood of children without love turned on itself in a contest over the trade that had grown up around it. In 1995, Tree Min Tran was murdered. He had come to Australia as a child of the boats, arrived around the age of 7, and led the gang before he was old enough to vote. Some accounts hold that he had wanted out of the heroin by the end. He was killed in a power struggle, one of his own generation, dead before he was 20. The figure the media had built into the face of Cabramatta's fall was gone, and the suburb was no safer for it. The cameras came for the worst of it and then left. Television crews filmed the station the way crews film a foreign war, and the footage carried a single message to the rest of the country: stay away. Cabramatta became a national shorthand, a word that meant drugs and gangs and foreignness and collapse, spoken by people who had never walked its streets and never would. The framing was not accurate. It was not that the suburb was a lawless enclave that had chosen its own ruin. It was that a poor, isolated, still unwelcome community had been left to absorb, more or less alone, a heroin epidemic that no wealthier part of Sydney would have been asked to carry. To the rest of the country, Cabramatta was a warning. To the people who lived there, it was something else entirely. It was home. It was the shops their parents had opened, the temple, the plaza with the gate that named liberty and democracy, the streets where they had been children. And it was breaking in front of them, funeral by funeral. And the people who felt each loss most were not the reporters or the policymakers or the audiences watching from the far side of the harbour. They were the residents, and they were the ones with nowhere else to go and no intention of going. Chapter 9. The Comeback. Around the turn of the century, the thing that everyone had stopped expecting began to happen. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen for any single reason, which is part of why it was so hard for the outside world to see while it was underway. One cause was national and had nothing to do with Cabramatta at all. Beginning around 2001, Australia experienced a sudden and sustained heroin drought. The supply that had flooded the country through the 90s contracted sharply. The price rose, the purity fell, and the open market that had made the railway station Notorious lost the cheap product it ran on. A second cause was money. On the 27th of March 2001, the state government announced a package aimed squarely at the suburb, some $18.8 million over about 4 years, directed at policing, health, and the drug trade. A third was sustained pressure on the market itself, a permanent policing presence where there had been a token one. None of that on its own would have held. What held it was the community. This is the part the headlines had never been able to imagine, because the headlines had spent a decade describing Cabramatta as the problem rather than as the place most desperate to end it. Parents who had buried children organized, elders who had crossed an ocean to build the suburb refused to watch it be defined by its worst years. Young people who had grown up in the middle of the crisis ran anti-drug campaigns aimed at the ones coming up behind them. The people who had suffered the epidemic most directly became the ones who did the daily unglamorous work of pulling the suburb back out of it, on their own streets, among their own families. The numbers moved with a speed that startled the agencies measuring them. In the year from the middle of 2000 to the middle of 2001, the number of needles dispensed in the suburb fell by around 59%, and heroin overdoses fell by around 74%. A place that had been the country's most infamous open drug market recorded in 12 months. A collapse in the visible trade that no one had dared forecast. The station stopped being the smack express. The overdoses in the stairwells became rarer, and then rare, it would be inaccurate. And it would be an insult to hand that recovery to the police or the government alone. The drought and the funding and the policing were real, and they mattered, and they arrived at the same time, but drugs had ebbed and returned before, and money had been announced before, and neither had ever rebuilt the fabric of a place. What made this turn hold was that the people who lived in Cabramatta decided it would, and did the holding themselves, in a suburb that the rest of the country had already written off. The community that had lived through the worst of it led the recovery from it. Chapter 10. The suburb that refused to stay a headline. Cabramatta. Today is not a crime scene. It is a destination. People travel across Sydney to reach it, not to gawk at it, but to eat in it. Drawn from the eastern suburbs and the North Shore and the inner west to a strip of Vietnamese and Southeast Asian food regarded as among the best in the country. The restaurants and the herbalists and the grocers that the first refugees opened in a poor, half-built suburb are now the reason the city comes. On the weekends, the footpaths are crowded. The station that was once the most notorious drug market in the nation is now, more than anything, the place people arrive when they have come to eat. Once a year, the suburb holds the Lunar New Year festival, and the streets fill entirely. The crowds run to the tens of thousands. There are lion dances and stalls and firecrackers along the same pavements that television crews once filmed as a war zone, and the images that leave Cabramatta now are images of a celebration. The suburb is famous, in the end, for close to the exact opposite of what it was once famous for, which is a thing that almost never happens to a place once the country has decided what it is. Picture Freedom Plaza on a crowded evening. The Pai Lau Gate, raised in 1991 and inscribed with the words "For Liberty and Democracy," stands lit above the plaza, and beneath it the diners and the market stalls run late into the night on the ground where the station once held its worst reputation. The streets are the same streets. The community is, in large part, the same community, and their children, and their grandchildren. Nothing about the place has been demolished and replaced. It has been remade, slowly and from the inside, by the same hands that built it the first time, and then refused to let it be lost. Both stories are true at once, and the plaza holds both of them. The worst years were real, and they were not exaggerated by the people who lived through them, only by the people who watched from a distance. The recovery was real too, and it was not handed down. It was made here, on this ground, under this gate, by a community that carried the crisis and then carried the suburb back out of it. A place can be the most feared address in the country and one of the most loved within a single lifetime on the same corners. And standing under the lit gate on a crowded night, with the food and the noise and the crowd moving through, the question that lingers is not which of those two things Cabramatta really is, but who, after everything, gets to decide what a suburb is, and when the last word on it will finally be spoken.